Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, a truly fascinating story, I think. It spans continents, reveals some really surprising connections. We're talking about the history and evolution of the Japanese diaspora in Brazil.
Yeah, and we'll be drawing heavily on this study, the Japanese diaspora in Brazil. It's kind of our roadmap for this.
Right.
Packed with historical background, demographic info, and insights into how the community integrated and even, which is quite remarkable, their missionary activities later on.
Exactly. So our mission for you today, the learner, is really to unpack this pretty significant migration. We want to get beyond just like the basic facts and figures and explore those maybe unexpected cultural exchanges, the demographic shifts, things that impacted both Brazil and Japan, actually.
Yeah, looking for those deeper connections and transformations.
Okay, so where does this incredible journey begin? What's the starting point?
Well, it really starts with a formal agreement.
Yeah.
Back in 1895, there was this Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between Japan and Brazil.
1895. Okay, so that laid the groundwork.
It opened the door, exactly. But the moment things really got moving was 1908. That's when the first Japanese ship arrived at Santos port.
Ah, the first ship. And it wasn't just a handful of people, was it? It carried a fair number.
No, definitely not symbolic. That first voyage brought 781 immigrants.
Wow.
And a big reason for that was a report by Fukashi Sugimura. He was the Japanese minister in Brazil. He wrote quite favorably about São Paulo's coffee plantations.
Ah, the coffee plantations. So that was the main driver.
For those early immigrants, yes. It was primarily contract work on the coffee plantations in São Paulo state. That's what they came for.
Okay, so Brazil needed labor. Japan had people looking for opportunities. What kind of scale are we talking about overall? Was it a steady stream?
It was pretty substantial over time. The total figure is around 250,000 Japanese immigrants to Brazil.
250,000.
Yeah. And you can really break it down into two main waves, sort of. The biggest one was pre-World War II, between 1908 and 1941. That was about 190,000 people.
Okay, the vast majority then.
Right. Then after the war, things picked up again in the 50s and 60s. There was a second, smaller wave, maybe around 60,000 more immigrants came then.
That's still a significant number. Now, Brazil wasn't exactly an empty land when they arrived. What was the demographic situation like? Who was already there?
That's a really crucial point. Brazil already had this incredibly complex mix. You had the Portuguese colonizers, obviously, the various indigenous Brazilian groups, sometimes called Indians in older texts, and critically, millions of enslaved Africans brought over centuries.
Right, so a long history of mixing and interaction was already happening.
Absolutely. These groups had been interacting, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, for hundreds of years before these other large immigrant groups, like the Japanese, started arriving.
So where did the Japanese immigrants fit into this already diverse picture? Does the study give us some context with numbers?
It does, yeah. Table 1 in the source is helpful here. What really jumps out is the dominance of Southern European immigrants.
Like Italians, Portuguese?
Exactly. Portuguese, Italians, Spanish. They made up something like 3/4 of all immigrants to Brazil. Huge numbers.
Wow. So where did the Japanese fit in, percentage-wise?
Well, total Japanese number, around 247,000 across those main periods, is significant on its own, but it works out to about 5% of the total immigrant population.
5%. Still substantial.
Definitely. And the table also shows, Middle Easterners and others category, just highlighting how diverse that immigration really was.
Okay, so 5%. How did they cope with the huge linguistic and cultural differences? That must have been tough.
Oh, absolutely. Learning Portuguese, which is, completely different from Japanese, was a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
But the study does point to their adaptability. They learned the language, they interacted with other immigrant groups, and even in some areas with the indigenous populations already there.
Interacting with indigenous communities.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. It suggests it wasn't just about fitting into the European-descended society.
No, it was likely much more complex depending on the region.
Yeah.
And the source also mentions religion playing a role in adaptation for some.
How so?
Particularly for Japanese immigrants who embraced Christianity. It seems to have given them a sort of framework for rethinking their cultural, maybe even racial identity within this new Brazilian context.
Interesting. And Brazil itself is so diverse regionally. Did that affect how immigrants integrated in different places?
For sure. The study mentions this explicitly. You have, say, the Amazon region with a really strong indigenous cultural presence.
Right.
Then Bahia, deeply influenced by its African heritage. The Northeast, which sociologist Gilberto Freire famously described as this tri-ethnic blend in indigenous African Portuguese.
Okay.
And then contrast that with the southern states like Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul, which received many more German and Italian immigrants, giving them a more European feel.
And São Paulo State was the main hub for the Japanese initially, you said, because of the coffee.
Yes, exactly. That's where the jobs were initially on the plantations. So most immigrants, including the Japanese, settled there first.
Right.
And that concentration over time helped fuel São Paulo's growth into this massive, wealthy, cosmopolitan center.
Makes sense. But they didn't all stay in São Paulo forever, did they? How did the community spread out?
No, definitely not. Internal migration within Brazil is a huge part of the story. As opportunities opened up elsewhere, new farming areas, growing cities, universities, industries.
People moved?
People moved. Laborers, professionals, families. So Japanese immigrants and their descendants, the Nikkei, eventually settled in literally every state in Brazil.
Even way up north?
Yep. Even north of the Amazon River, in places like Roraima and Amapá. It's a truly nationwide presence now.
That's quite a dispersal over a century or so, and presumably the Japanese government has kept track, maintained ties.
Oh, yes. Japan maintains its embassy in Brasilia, of course, but also 7 general consulates spread across different regions.
7, okay.
And these consulates actively facilitate cultural exchanges, scientific cooperation, tech, economic ties, keeping that connection between Japan and the diaspora in Brazil alive and well.
So it's not just history, it's an ongoing relationship. Now, the study brings up a really interesting angle, the diaspora as a mission field. What does that mean in this context?
It's looking at it through a religious lens. The study references work by John Mizuki back in the 1970s, who started documenting how the Japanese community in Brazil became a place where Christian churches, specifically, started to grow and develop.
So churches specifically focused on or originating from the Japanese community.
Exactly. And Mizuki's work looked at the various denominations that were active then.
And fast forward to today, how large is this Japanese-Brazilian church presence?
Well, the estimates mentioned in the study are around 25 distinct Japanese-Brazilian denominations, some quite small, others larger, and maybe about 150 individual Nikkei churches across Brazil.
150 churches.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is the leadership. You now have first, second, and even third generation Japanese-Brazilian pastors leading these congregations.
Following the generations, are these churches still mostly clustered in São Paulo and nearby?
There's still a big concentration there, yeah. Greater São Paulo, Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, those areas are key.
Right.
But just like the population dispersed, so did the churches. They've followed the community to more distant states, to Mato Grosso, Bahia, Rio Grande do Sul, even up in the Amazonian states like Pará and Amazonas.
So they're really spread out now. And is it only these specific Nikkei churches, or have Japanese Brazilians also joined other sort of mainstream Brazilian denominations?
Oh, definitely the latter, too. While some denominations have made specific efforts to reach the Japanese community, many other churches, Pentecostal, Baptist, Presbyterian, you name it, have seen Japanese Brazilians join their congregations. It shows integration into the wider religious landscape, too.
But the study makes a point that this mission within the diaspora itself isn't necessarily finished.
Precisely. It talks about new fields and untouched fields, suggesting there are still parts of the community, maybe geographically or socially, that haven't been significantly reached by these evangelistic efforts.
Okay.
And as Japanese Brazilians have integrated into all parts of society, moving into the middle class and professions, it actually creates new contexts and opportunities for this kind of religious engagement.
This leads nicely into the idea of shifting identities within these churches. The study uses the Evangelical Holiness Church in Brazil as a case study, right? With some data.
Yes. Table 2 is really illuminating here. It looks at the leadership, the executive board of the EHCB over time, and tracks their background.
How do they categorize them?
They use terms like Japanese for those born in Japan, second gen, for those born in Brazil to Japanese parents, second 12, third gen, and then Brazilian for members with no Japanese ancestry.
Okay, tracking the generational shift.
Exactly. And the trend is crystal clear.
What does it show?
Well, Portuguese became the main language for the church's official business way back in the 1980s. And by 2012, which is pretty striking, there wasn't a single person born in Japan left on the executive board.
Wow, none at all. That's a complete shift in leadership origins.
It is, and it reflects what was happening in the local churches, too.
Is it just about language and birthplace, though? Or does it suggest something deeper about the church's identity?
The study argues it's deeper. It signifies a move away from being perhaps primarily an ethnic church focus on the first generation, towards embracing a more multiracial, pluralistic identity that mirrors Brazil itself.
So more mixed congregations.
Yeah. You might have churches where Nikkei people are still the majority, others where non-Nikkei Brazilians are the majority, and some larger churches might even have services in both Japanese and Portuguese to cater to everyone. It's become much more blended.
This evolving identity is fascinating, especially because it then leads to this next stage. The Brazilian-Japanese diaspora actually sending out its own missionaries. That feels like a full circle moment.
It really is quite something. Take the EHCB again. Even though they didn't have, a huge surplus of pastors for their own churches in Brazil.
Right.
They felt this call to engage in mission work outside Brazil. So back in 1992, they sent their first missionaries, Reverend Shinji and Raquel Cano, to Japan.
To Japan, sending missionaries back to the ancestral homeland, essentially.
Exactly. Initially, it was kind of an interdenominational effort, working with others. But eventually, their focus shifted towards establishing their own EHCB church communities, specifically within Japan.
And who are they aiming to reach in Japan?
Primarily, the Brazilian Nikkei community living in Japan. There's a large number of them, maybe around 300,000 people, who went there for work opportunities, often in factories.
Ah, the Dekasegi phenomenon.
Precisely. And often facing hardships, loneliness, cultural adjustments. The study suggests this made many of them quite open to the Christian message being brought by fellow Brazilians.
So they started Portuguese language services.
Yes. Regular services in Portuguese are now held in about 8 locations across Japan for this community. And you see pastors traveling back and forth between Brazil and Japan more frequently now to support this work.
That's incredible. And the outreach didn't stop with Japan, did it? The study mentions China and India, too.
That's right. There's a story about a young woman from one of the EHCB churches, Campo Grande Holiness Church, who felt called to China.
Okay.
She got missionary training, joined up with a Brazilian team from YWAM Youth with a mission, and started working in Macau.
Macau. Interesting choice.
Yeah. And she later married a Brazilian pastor, and they now lead a joint ministry there, supported by both the EHCB and another denomination, Pinhale Church.
So a collaborative effort there, too.
Yes. And apparently they've even had visits from Portuguese-speaking holiness churches based in Japan coming to see their work in Macau. These networks are really interconnected.
Wow. And what about India? There was a specific story there, too.
Yeah, quite an interesting one. An EHCB missionary, originally a civil engineer, became a youth leader, then got YWAM training, and he and his wife moved to India about 18 years ago, according to the study.
And what's his role there?
He's apparently taken on a significant leadership position within YWAM India. The fact that he speaks multiple languages, English, Konkani, Hindustani, has been a huge asset. He oversees a large number of staff and volunteers now.
From civil engineer in Brazil to mission leader in India. Remarkable.
It really is.
The study also mentioned mission work within Brazil itself, targeting less reached areas.
Yes, focusing particularly on the Northeast. It highlights the work of Marcio and Elevane Sato. They work with an agency called JUVEP.
JUV.
It's an interdenominational mission focused on planting churches in parts of Brazil considered less evangelized. Marcio uses his background in business and theology to organize these big, one-month intensive evangelism projects every year.
A month-long push.
Yeah, saturation evangelism, aiming to establish new, lasting church congregations in those communities.
So this diaspora community is active both internationally and domestically in mission work. It really paints a picture of deep integration and, well, transformation.
Absolutely.
And then the study wraps up with a really profound point, suggesting a unique Brazilian contribution to mission theology itself.
Yes, this is about the third Lausanne Conference on World Evangelization, which was held in Cape Town, South Africa in 2010.
Okay, a major global Christian gathering.
Exactly. And the Brazilian delegation there did something quite extraordinary.
Right.
They prepared and presented a formal letter of apology.
An apology for what?
For Brazil's history of slavery and the slave trade, which lasted nearly 400 years.
Wow. That's huge. Who did they present it to?
They specifically presented it during the African regional meeting at the conference. Can you imagine the scene?
No, tell me, what was the reaction?
Deeply emotional, according to the account. There was prayer, weeping, singing, just a very powerful moment. And after the letter was read, there's this declaration of forgiveness from the African attendees.
A declaration of forgiveness right there.
Yes. And later, African leaders actually came to the Brazilian regional gathering to formally acknowledge and affirm their acceptance of the apology.
That sounds incredibly moving and significant.
It really does. And the study proposes that this public repentance and the resulting reconciliation might be seen as a distinctively Brazilian contribution to the global conversation about mission and ethics.
Confronting a difficult past on a global stage like that, it definitely adds another layer to this whole story. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main things you think we and the learner should take away?
Well, I think it's the sheer scope of the journey, isn't it? From Japanese contract laborers arriving over a century ago
Right, for the coffee fields.
to becoming this vibrant, deeply integrated Brazilian community. A community that's not only found its place, but is now actively reaching out, sending missionaries back to Japan, to China, India, and within Brazil itself.
Yeah, that arc is amazing.
And we've seen how it was all shaped by, historical treaties, massive demographic shifts, the challenges and successes of cultural adaptation, and even these religious movements playing a significant role.
And that final point about the apology for slavery.
Yeah, that adds this powerful dimension of Brazil grappling with its own complex history and perhaps offering a model for reconciliation.
A really rich and multi-layered story. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. How does this story, the journey of the Japanese diaspora in Brazil, maybe challenge your own ideas about identity, about what it means to belong, and how interconnected our world really is?
Yeah, and what other surprising stories of migration and cultural blending are out there that we could learn from? It makes you think.
It does. And maybe also, what does it really take for a nation or even a community to honestly face its past and try to build reconciliation in the present? Lots to think about there.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.